Michael, you want to bring us up to speed a little bit on some of the arguments you've been hearing, if I can put you on the spot a little bit on that. I'd appreciate that.
No, I'd be more than happy to. Once again, this is Mike Dunleavy down in Juneau, and thanks for all that you folks do, and thanks for keeping us on our toes. It's good to know, seriously, that there are folks out there.
Oh, no problem, Michael. You don't even have to ask me to do that. This is Maria. Okay, I'll shut up.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is it's very important that there's folks out there like you, because when you get down to Juneau here, some people have a tendency to forget that they were elected and not appointed by themselves to these roles, and that we represent folks, and especially those of us on the more conservative side, that we represent individuals and not special interest or special interest groups. So I just appreciate what you guys are doing. So again, SJR 9 is, it's been fascinating. I probably could enroll in law school here when we're done and maybe get some credit for all the work we've done down here on this. But the long story short is our Constitution. I don't know if anyone has it in front of them, but if they don't, that's fine. But basically, Article 7 under Health, Educational Welfare. You have Section 1, which is public education. And we've been going over this office for months, every day, including today. We've been reviewing the minutes from the Constitutional Convention, in which our framers here in Alaska had great, long, deep discussions on what wording should go into this section. And it's very clear that they left out the phrase, the concept of indirect. In other words, what it says here now is the legislature shall by general law establish and maintain a system of public schools open to all children of the state, and may provide for other public educational institutions. Schools and institutions so established shall be free from sectarian control. No money shall be paid from public funds for the direct benefit of any religious or other private educational institution. They left out the concept of indirect. And again, I would strongly urge folks to read the minutes from the Constitutional Convention, because it gives you a whole other perspective, and I would dare say the correct perspective as to what the folks meant at that time. So they left out indirect because they knew there would be times and instances and situations in which individual children would need to have public support to attend not necessarily public school. And where I'm going with this is about 15 years ago, after Lauren Lehman, and quite honestly, bless Lauren Lehman, because what he did was he legalized. I know this sounds silly for some of us that are constitutionalists and believe that there's inherent rights that we all have and are not granted by the state. But he recognized, I should say, not legalized, recognized a homeschool situation in Alaska. In other words, he helped pass a law that allowed parents to homeschool their kids divorced of any program without being tracked, without being followed, without being tested. So basically he freed a segment of Alaska's population to be able to be who they want to be. Well, around the same time, there was a public homeschool movement as well. And the idea behind the public homeschool movement would be for those folks that want to homeschool their children, but wanted to still be associated with public schooling. In other words, they get assistance, and they would agree to take a test, and they would agree to get a public diploma. They would be allowed to determine the how their child would be educated, where their child would be educated. So in a public homeschool program, for example, in the Mat-Su, you have the Mat-Su Central School, which has 1,700 students in it. It's a homeschool correspondence program, K-12. It's the largest school in the Mat-Su. It's the fastest growing school in the Mat-Su. And long story short, what you do there is you go in and you enroll, and they draw up an individual ILP, you, the teacher, and your child. And you, the parent, knowing your child better than anyone, you get a larger say, probably the largest say in any of the public educational institutions as to how and what the child is going to be educated with and where. And so for 15 years, we've been giving public allotments to help meet this educational need. And a public allotment is basically another word for voucher. So in the MATSU, for example, when a child enrolls, they bring in $5,800 to that school system. It only costs $4,400 to educate the kid in that program. Out of that $4,400, $2,500 is set aside as a public allotment, a public voucher, basically. So when you draw up your ILP, your individual learning plan, and let's say you're in high school and you need 5 courses, you, your parent, with assistance from the teacher, get to select what vendors, we call them vendors, educational service providers, what vendors you choose to pick from. So, for example, my daughter elected to go to the Matthew Central School this year from Wasilla High. There was no problem with Wasilla High. She enjoyed being there. It was meeting her needs. She went down to the Matthew Central School and enrolled because she wanted to take some electives to study for the SATs and the ACTs, and they didn't provide this at Wasilla High. Long story short, she went down there and she enrolled in the program. She got the $2,500. We set up an ILP. So she's taking a Kaplan course to help her study for the SAT, and this is an elective, so it goes towards her credits for electives. She's also doing a study course for the ACT. She goes to Wasilla High for ROTC, which she's been in for 2 years. She goes to Wasilla High to take 1 class of physics. Now they're viewed as vendors in this scenario, but she also takes a journalism class from Brigham Young University. Well, and she also takes a government class through an online for-profit private provider called Odysseyware. Well, Odysseyware, BYU, and the Kaplan courses are all private. Some are for profit, and at least one is a religious-based educational provider. Under the current language of our Constitution, the language and the intent of the framers, this is perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. There's no problem with money going indirectly to private and or religious education providers, indirectly through the child, through a public allotment, also known as a voucher. However, the courts, on at least 3 different occasions over the past 40 years, have ruled against this indirect concept. So where the framers wanted to allow folks to be able to use public funds through children to help educate their kids, and some of that money, if it incidentally or indirectly went to private and or religious education providers, the framers and the language in the Constitution allow for that to happen. But the courts, some would say they were liberal courts, but the courts have ruled consistently that in their mind, in their rulings, they see embedded within that language no indirect aid as well. It's consistent through the Sheldon Jackson case, the busing issues up in Fairbanks and down in Ketchikan. We've had a constitutional scholar by the name of Dick Comer out there in D.C. with the Institute of Justice. He's been working on this issue for several years, and he believes that the only way we can get back to what the framers wanted and their intent and what the language intends is we have to be incredibly explicit in a constitutional amendment. We have to be incredibly explicit. And basically, that is what SJR 9 does. SJR 9 changes 2 sections of the Constitution. Section 1 under public education, it would get rid of the last sentence, no money shall be paid from public funds for the direct benefit of any religious or other private educational institution. And then in Section 6, public purpose, he has suggested that we add where it says, no tax shall be levied or appropriation of public money made or public property transferred, nor shall the public credit be used except for a public purpose, semicolon. However, nothing in this section shall prevent payment for public funds for the direct educational benefit of students as provided by law. He believes that by changing the language in that fashion, it would be ironclad for Alaska to decide if they want to pass money through to kids for an expanded public homeschool concept, using vendors like, for example, we can't even use APU, Alaska Pacific University, as a vendor because it's private and it's Methodist. Yet, you can have a child that graduates from high school at the age of 15, the next day they can get money from the state in the form of, quote, scholarships and grants to attend Alaska Bible College, Wayland Baptist College, Alaska Pacific University, and several other private religious-affiliated post-secondary institutions. No problem. You could have a 19-year-old that needs one class to graduate from high school, and if they live right next to APU, they would not be allowed to use public money to take a class there to graduate. So many of us believe that if we're able to change this language, we could lower the cost of education and expand the different possibilities for parents and kids to be educated in Alaska. I'll stop there and entertain any questions. I also just wanted to add here in just a couple minutes what some of the different programs look like down south, because I think it's important for folks to understand that what's going on down there as well.
All right, thank you, Mike. And go ahead and announce yourself, unmute yourself, announce yourself, and I'll try to field questions.
Maria?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, this is Michael Chambers. Michael, I'd like to ask you very clearly with regard to this Supreme Court of the State of Alaska ruling that direct is actually indirect, or indirect is actually direct, and that they ruled against any of this levying this money if there was an individual out there that was an activist with regard to the Blaine Amendment. Couldn't they force the issue with the state of Alaska with regard to this blending of funds?
They could, Mike, and we thought about that. The concern that we have is when I was an administrator at the Matsu Central School, and I got involved with both the homeschool folks that are divorced of any public school program and those that are involved in the public homeschool program. What happened was early on, we enticed, when I say we, I mean the system. We enticed many of those folks to come into the system under the belief that they would be able to determine the how. In other words, they would buy courses from places they thought were appropriate for their children in order to meet a public purpose, but also their own individual value system. And so we had a number of these folks enroll in the program, and then the Department of Education started to change the rules. People started to jerk these folks around. And so many of them left, and eventually the Department of Education wrote in regulations that, in my opinion, were so onerous, it basically chased people out of the system. And so what we decided to do, getting back to your question, Mike, we could do that, but we run the risk of, once again, giving folks false hope that if they join the programs, that they'll be able to educate their children in the manner they see fit. What we're afraid of is if we do that, there will be court action. There'll be an injunction that shuts the programs down. And once again, these folks will be kicked out of the programs. So we talked about whether we do that route or whether we try and change the constitutional language. Neither approach is ideal from the standpoint of, it's a heavy lift either way. It's problematic either way. It's disruptive either way. But we felt at this time that it would be best to go through the constitutional language process, and I'll add for two other reasons. We have residential boarding facilities in the state of Alaska. The folks don't think about this, but on Sunday, when you have children 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and you're acting in the capacity of parents on Sunday, you can't deny those kids the ability to go to church. So we use state resources in many of these programs to take the kids to church. That would be highly suspect and probably subject to some type of court action under the current court precedent that's happened over 40 years. And the other thing we were concerned about is we have scholarships in this state, post-secondary scholarships for young folks, that if we did force some type of court action, those scholarships would also be shut down. Would it bring this to a head in a larger discussion? Absolutely. And I'm not saying it was kind of 6 of one and a half dozen of another, I guess. I hope I answered the question.
Hi, this is Barbara in Fairbanks. Can I make a contribution to your discussion?
Please, Barbara, sure.
because I was very heavily involved in both pieces of legislation that you referenced. I want to make a few observations. Number one, when the publicly funded homeschooling program was brought in, this is really what people do not understand. The reason why the NEA backed off is because we were saving NEA positions, okay? Because what happened, what was really going on is Galena City Schools was going to be with all these contracts, and they were going to bump Anchorage teachers, apparently, or there was some deal that the teachers in Anchorage were afraid they were going to get bumped or something, or somebody was going to get bumped because they were closing the base down in Galena and transferring those people out. It was like a huge, heavy hit to the community. And so they would try, what the goal was, in Rod Popcock's mind, was he was trying to figure out a way to keep the school afloat and save the positions, but he didn't know where he was going to get the students from. And I was an economist at the time working on the stock market game, and I'm the one who put the bug in his ear to think about trying to figure out how to do this. And the grand compromise, okay, was that there would be NEA positions. In other words, there would be, because see, the other way we could have done the correspondence program was just cut the local districts out. We could have had people just deal directly with DOE, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea was, at that time, in the mid-'90s, communications were not as good. They're still not very good in the state, but they were not as very good. I mean, they were better than in most places, but it's, not like today. The thinking was that some key smaller districts could service people who weren't being served anyway. There was no way they were going to go and be a part of anything that had to do with Rick Crossman. All right? It was Rick Crossman in the DOE that people abhorred. I mean, anyway, I don't want to get into personalities. The point was that was the grand compromise, is that there would be NEA positions preserved. At the same time, we could buy whatever curriculum we wanted, okay? And people actually used their allotment in some instances to pay for certain courses at, like, for example, Monroe. You could, buy a course from Monroe. I mean, there was a lot of things that went on. Some of it was probably kind of hinky, but the reality was those people weren't in the system anyway. So it wasn't really screwing any district out of money because those people weren't in the district. It wasn't costing taxpayer money because we had already lost in the tax rebate. At the same time, we were able to get something, all right? And the NEA didn't oppose it, which takes you to court, by the way. That's why none of this stuff has been litigated, because there's these NEA positions involved. I mean, if you look at these correspondence programs, you have these teachers that are there. They're NEA members. And so they have the union has an interest in keeping these schools afloat, okay? And that's why you haven't seen a lot of court action. In the case of Brigham Young, it's because of the sheer volume and number of people who are, I hate to say this, but the people of the Mormon faith are very numerous in the state. They're very powerful. Many of them are teachers, and they're not going to blink an eye about Brigham Young. In fact, the Fairbanks North Star School District, when they decided they were going to compete, finally, in the correspondence programs, they started with Brigham Young University and Bob Jones. All right? So this whole notion of you can't use money on religious material is something that came out of Gary Wilkin. All right? I mean, that was a big policy change he went after. I mean, he was absolutely ornery, okay, about it. But and I don't, there was a lot of other history there, and I'm just going to let that drop. The point is that the only way something gets a court challenge is if you piss off somebody. So you work out the compromise so that the two sides both get what they want. That's how we got publicly funded homeschooling, because we dropped the property tax issue.
Right.
Okay. Mike, if you have comments, go ahead. But otherwise, I'm just for other questions.
I think Barbara's right on. I mean, she was involved in that, and she's got excellent history on it. The only thing I would say is, I think as we go down the road and we try and expand these programs, because just to be very brief, my daughter was sitting in a $14,000 seat at Wasilla. When she walked across the street to the Matsu Central School, she didn't walk into a $4,400 seat. So as time goes on, and if we cannot fund schools to the tune of $100 million extra every year, these programs will become more inviting and supported more. But the problem is, I think that relationship that Barbara was talking about could become unbalanced as more and more kids go to these programs and more districts try and get them to go to the programs because of the cost difference between that and a seat in a school. I think what you're going to end up seeing is NEA start to question having one teacher servicing 150 to 200 clients. But anyway, Barbara's right on.
Well, there is a way to work around that. And what you could do is you could say, look, this technology thing is going to come, whether it's us this year or whether it's 5 years down the road. If you get ahead of it and help us out here, we can still preserve your membership base for those who are still in the system, and maybe even expand that membership base, and we can work together. And instead of you dealing with a bunch of brats, you're dealing with the parents, which is, really, in a way, it's like getting a teaching assistant. It's, once a teacher has been a correspondence teacher rather than a classroom teacher, it's like, whoa, life is so good. I don't have to screw around class preps late at night and grade papers late at night. Is it just a different world?
You're right.
The other contribution I want to make here, and I think it's very worthwhile bearing here. When those funded homeschool programs were initiated, there was not a statewide, you didn't have the No Child Left Behind provisions. There was the fourth grade essay. It was a fourth grade essay and a seventh grade essay. I was one of the graders. The writing prompt was revealed like on the internet, like it was like this magic moment, like everybody sat there at their emails and waited, and the writing prompt came in, boom, okay? And, everybody went about writing. You could fax in your, you had different ways you could return your answer. And, it was quite a deal, but it was like an hour and a half, and it was done. And you had your writing, you had your English assessment done. And I thought back then it was a much meatier assessment than what we have now under No Child Left Behind and definitely under Common Core. I mean, that's just my take on it. And you did have to prove certain math skills at certain grade levels, but they were recommendations so that if you had a child, that you can't legislate scope and sequence, even if Common Core would like to do so. If you had a child who was lagging, there was still a way for them to catch up because they were GLEs, not mandates. And GLEs, or expectations, this is what we expect them to do. This is what we hope they can do. And, they're generally kind of minimal because it's what you would expect the bottom of the rung to be able to do, not the top of the rung. But that became something else later down the road, and so I'll shut up about that. But as long as you have Common Core testing, I hate to tell you, you're going to kill your correspondence programs completely. That the Common Core standards and that whole gizmo's got to go. I applaud the use of the ACT and the SAT. I think personally, I know the governor really likes work keys, but I think it's useless. I think the test of adult basic education is a much better test. Now I'll shut up.
Michael. Yes, I have another specific question. Is that this SJR 9 it's still in committee and it could be altered? Is that correct?
Yes, it's in the Rules Committee. Last week.
Very specifically, I'd like you to look at, and this might be a very small change, but, the part of the ad, it says in students, and students under the law, if you change that and it said and student, in other words, it follows the student instead of students. I think that would clarify, to some extent that this money follows the student.
You're talking in Section 6, the public purpose, where the new language says, however, nothing in this section shall prevent payment from public funds for the direct educational benefit of students as provided by law?
Yeah, for the direct benefit of a student as provided, instead of students.
I'll make a note here, Mike. Okay.
See, because, here's clearly the problem, and this is the argument that I get out there in the public on a regular basis, is that this is public money. And I try to continue to explain to them that the resources of the state of Alaska belong to the citizens of Alaska. And, obviously the education foundation, they obviously don't want to talk about that. They don't want that, and nor does the legislature. I think that they have a real problem in letting go of that money and realizing that it is actually the citizens' money. But if you say that money follows the student, I think it implies a more specific nature.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, this is James Squires in Delta Junction. We were talking to a number of people in the area here, and they've had some concerns that you had kind of mentioned that it may cost the state less money, and just out of the box they were adamant that this was going to cost the state more money, and they were concerned that there would be all these strings attached if money were to flow to a religious school. And they were also fearful that the government was coming after the independent homeschooler. Now, I'll tell you, the group that we were talking to was in a Bible study. So can you address some of those points, please?
Yeah, very good question, and I've heard that as well. I'll be as brief as I possibly can. SJR 9 doesn't create any program. I know that there's been folks that have said once SJR 9 is in place, we're going to have universal vouchers, et cetera, et cetera. Creates no program. So what would happen is, when SJR 9 is passed and the language is changed in the Constitution, our Constitution would be like that of many other states, especially states east of the Mississippi River that did not have the Blaine Amendment put into their Constitution. In other words, we have states today. For example, I think it was in 72 and 76, two separate times, Nebraska altered its Constitution to allow public monies to flow through private institutions. They never enacted a program. So there sits the constitutional language with no program to access it. You have 26 states, I believe, with 47 programs, and those programs are targeted, they're self-contained, and they don't spiral or erupt into uncontrollable vouchers. It just doesn't happen. There's no precedence for it anywhere in the country. For example, you have a quote voucher system in Vermont that is at least 140 some years old, if not older, for students that live in villages or communities in Vermont that don't have a school. They can take the money and go to school anywhere in the world. But it's self-contained. It's targeted to specific and certain group. Now, so there's no spiral out of control in terms of money. The legislature would determine what that program would look like, and there is no universal vouchers or there's no universal approach anywhere in the country, in any of the states that have this language on in their constitution. As far as going after homeschoolers, the voice of the program, I have been adamant for years. I thought that the Lauren Lehman, I call it the Lauren Lehman bill, but the bill in the 90s that protected those folks, I would do nothing at all that would have the state come down on those folks. I would do everything I could to maintain their independence. I don't have any intention, and I don't see that ever happen. Well, I shouldn't say that. I will work to make sure that never happens, and it won't happen under this particular approach. In terms of the private schools or the religious schools, I believe that if you approach them as educational vendors that sell coursework to the, for example, to the homeschools, then they are treated just like Brigham Young University is. Brigham Young University is its own independent entity. It's private and religious-based. But because we buy coursework from it, doesn't mean we control it. Because the student decides and chooses where the coursework is going to come from, whether it's Brigham Young or in an expanded version, whether it's Monroe Catholic or Anchorage Christian, or it doesn't matter. If you purchase the coursework as opposed to tuition the school, I believe you maintain a separation that's fairly clean, and thus those schools remain independent and can follow their missions. So I've done my best, and I've worked with a whole number of people, both in-state and nationally, on this issue. I've been in contact with other states that have done this. I think Alaska, for example, the Friedman Foundation took a look at the plan that we're putting forth under SB 100, which is an expanded homeschool public homeschool concept where these vendors would be recognized as legitimate vendors. They looked at that compared to other programs across the country, and they liked it for a number of reasons. They said it maintains competition between school districts. It doesn't mandate an amount of money. It maintains the independence and separation of the service providers that could be private and religious schools. It doesn't force anyone into the program. So I think we've touched every base to ensure that it does good things for individuals and does not extend state control to any other schools, groups, etc.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike, and we really appreciate you coming on the State Wide Teleconference. This is, again, James from Delta Junction. I'll tell you, the education of this topic is really the key, because I talked with several individuals, and one of them kept bringing up the concept of unintended consequences. You know,
right.
The consequences as a result of this change in the Constitution, and this old sourdough, you know, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, he was pointing out the fact that anytime we take something in the Constitution and change it like we did, that was actually, the way he was seeing it, there was actually a limitation on there, and now we're removing a limitation. And being generally distrustful of the government, removing a limitation on the government can't end up, you know, as a good thing. So that was one of his concerns. Now, after another hour of discussion, he did end up calling Quick Bishop's office and lobby for SJR 9. But I'm just telling you, it's taken a lot to work through the weeds here.
I appreciate that. The last thing I want to do, everything I do down here, trust me is a bad thing to ask people.
Michael,
yes?
I can appreciate, I know your intentions are good, okay? Let me explain to you a couple of different things, like with Brigham Young. They have a separate holding company or a separate financial structure separated from the church for the provision of that curriculum. That's how they are able to get around the religious aspect, okay, is that they've got this, I don't want to say, it's a separate profit or not, it's a nonprofit set up separate from the church in order to provide the curriculum services. The people who have been doing this, like Brigham Young, have been very smart about how they've done it, okay? The big concern, and this is a big concern, is that there's been other things in that No Child Left Behind waiver that you're not, I don't know if you're aware of or if you're not looking at, but those could come back and be very harmful if those things aren't removed, because it's a source of attack, even without Blaine removed, it's a source of attack, all right? Because any standard you hold a teacher to is a standard that the Department of Children's Services can hold a homeschool parent to. Just saying.
That's interesting. I mean, I appreciate that.
And right now we've got a nice governor. But we had a period in time in history where we had a very evil governor named Tony Knowles. All right? And he decided, or his people decided, that if an NEA teacher had to meet certain expectations or certain parameters, that every homeschool mother had to meet them too. All right? And I was a homeschool mother at that time, and I was the subject of significant persecution at the hands of Tony Knowles over this. And Lauren Lehman, they actually remember this because this was part of the deal that sort of spawned a lot of stuff. Because I had never even intended to homeschool. That was not even on my radar. It was something that the Fairbanks district recommended that I do with one of my kids. So, because she was so advanced, it had nothing to do with anything. Anyway, the point is that there are things in those accountability measures that if the wrong person is in Juneau, it could be devastating. All right? Right now, you're thinking, you're a nice guy. I trust you. I trust Governor Parnell. All right? But, dadgum, get us Tony Knowles in there. I don't want my kids to be subjected to that. Because they are all homeschool parents now, So that's what when I'm looking at these things, that's what I'm thinking, is what if the wrong guy is in the office? Okay?
I have Barbara, I have a follow-up on that. This is Maria. I've been hearing from people along the same lines as what James Squires is talking about, that, is it in any way true, though, that the Blaine Amendment somehow protects us? It gives us a wall of separation between church and state idea.
The current language does protect, but it can be modified to preempt any challenges without raising the hackles of the NEA. And if I had been asked about this, and I wasn't, I would have recommended that rather than trying to remove the Blaine language, that language would have been added at the end to say, but may for the indirect benefit of the student, because that would also get us past Sheldon Jackson. This is much bigger, Mike, than primary and second K-12. This is higher ed as well. And the University of Alaska, the NEA, if they proceed to fight against them, they will. You saw the fury with which they came at the legislature. But the minute that they see that this is about higher ed, they will back right off. They will shut their damn mouths and sit down.
This is Mike. Can I jump in?
Please go ahead, Mike.
As far as the NEA, not a damn thing we do is going to get them to shut their damn mouth. I totally disagree with you, Barbara, on that one. The NEA is there for the NEA, and they're there for the NEA, and they're there for the NEA. They're not there for the teachers. They're not there for the students. They're not there for education. They are there for one thing and one thing only, power. That said, Michael, one of the, of course, as you well know, one of the major talking points of the NEA, through their teachers and through their surrogates, is that this is all about vouchers. Now, I know that you have said time and time again this has nothing to do, not a damn thing to do with vouchers. But how does SB 100 tie into this? I've also heard that the SB 100 is part and parcel of that voucher aspect that would go towards this once the constitutional amendment is finalized. And that's what I'm really kind of confused about a little bit, and then I'm just going to go mute and shut up.
So, Mike, do me a favor. Ask me the question one more time. Just the question.
Okay. The question is SB 100, is that tied in to this, and is that tied into vouchers? You touched on it a little bit, but I'm still confused on what SB 100 is and how it ties in with SJR 9 and HJR 1.
Okay, excellent. So SB 100 would be the program that would be underneath SJR 9. SJR 9 by and of itself really doesn't do anything. It's not a program. So SB 100 would be the program. And what SB 100 is There's a number of different parts of SB 100, but basically, pertaining to what we're discussing, it's an expanded homeschool concept, a public homeschool concept. It would recognize as legitimate educational vendors, regardless of whether they're private or religious. So that would be the first thing it would do. The second thing it would do is it would allow parents and families that enroll their children into these public homeschool programs to keep their allotment amount that they don't use from year to year. In other words, if Fairbanks gave them a $2,500 allotment, which again is a public voucher, and they only use $500 in kindergarten, then the following year they could have $4,500. Why are we doing that? Because we believe that parents can manage these funds better than bureaucrats, to be honest with you. And so they can maintain the money from year to year. It's really maintained by the school district, but it's in an account for the families. And as long as the family stays with that program, they get to keep rolling that money over that they don't use, so that when they go into middle school or high school, they could be using vendors such as the University of Alaska or APU. In the end, it's a much less expensive way to educate children while giving them maximum freedom under a public concept, a public homeschool concept. So as far as what people are saying, Mike, this voucher thing, what they're trying to do is instill in the minds of people that money will go directly from the state of Alaska into a Catholic school or Christian school for the purpose of tuition for an individual to sit there all day long, and not just for mathematics or language arts, but for the religious aspect. No one that I have talked to that is a proponent of SJR 9 really wants to do that. A. B. Under the 2002 Cleveland case, also known as Zellman, in the 5-4 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, they said that it was constitutional, under the U.S. Supreme Court, constitutional for the child and the family to take public funds to be educated if they make the decision. So it's on an individual child basis. Our own Constitution, unlike some other constitutions, we have a First Amendment as well in our Constitution. So both the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and our First Amendment, many of us believe, including Comer, who's the justice again in Washington, D.C., is trying to help us. He's with the Institute of Justice. Believe that we can accomplish the indirect concept through the homeschool correspondence programs by utilizing vendors to purchase coursework from, without this concept of a universal growing voucher situation. We don't foresee that, and we don't plan on that. We plan on just expanding the public homeschool correspondence concept.
Hey, can I do a quick follow-up on that? There's two simple questions. Well, one simple question, one maybe you might take a little longer on. One, then, let's say that I've got a kid in school and I'm paying my 60% of my property taxes going towards that child's education. If I want that kid to homeschool, or I want that kid to go to a private school, whatever, does that mean that does this take that money that I was? Am I still in double jeopardy? I guess in essence, am I still paying that property taxes and still paying for additional private schooling, or is this just take care of all of it, and I don't have to worry about a double? So I think these people right now are paying double, right?
Right.
That's what some folks feel. Yes.
Okay, and then the other follow up on it was that let's see, you're saying it's 45. You were saying like $4,000. Let's say $4,500. If I've got a child that I want to go to a Baptist church or Baptist school, and so that kid goes to that $4,500, since that is my money, or i.e. the student's money, then I could choose how I want, if I want that kid to take a religion class or not. And that wouldn't really violate the quote-unquote separation of church and state, which it doesn't exist anyway. But is that true? Would that be a truism?
That's not how we're interpreting it, Mike.
Okay.
Your allotment money, you would join a public homeschool correspondence concept. You would be given an allotment, and that allotment would be determined by the school district. For the MATSU, currently it's $2,500. Under SB 100, it would recognize, if they wanted to be part of this, it would recognize private and or religious based educational vendors. They would have to sign up and want to be a vendor. So, for example, theoretically speaking, if Monroe Catholic in Fairbanks decided that they wanted to be a vendor, they would sign up with a homeschool program. Could be MATSU, could be several of them in the state of Alaska, and say we'd like to be recognized as a vendor to sell educational services in the area of Latin or language arts or mathematics, whatever. And then what they would do is they could sell a seat in Latin to a homeschool student who would then take their public allotment money and maybe purchase that seat, and I'm just making the figure up here, $200 for that seat, that Latin course. They would go and they would sit in that seat, they would take the Latin course, but they're not using their money to pay for tuition, which includes and encompasses the religious aspect. Certainly there's religion there as they're taking the course. Anyone that sends their kids to Monroe Catholic knows that. But the state is not paying for religion, and the state would not pay for religion. It would merely pay for the public outcome, the public course in, once again, Latin or mathematics to support the child's public ILP. But theoretically speaking, and I'll end it with this, you could have a public ILP that says they'll take 5 courses at Monroe Catholic. So you would purchase 5 seats with your $2,500, and who knows? I don't know what Monroe Catholic would charge or any other vendor would charge. But nonetheless, you could theoretically have a child under public ILP taking language arts, mathematics, science, a foreign language, something else at Monroe Catholic as a recognized vendor, but they would be paying for those seats for those secular course concepts as vendors to support a public ILP.
And that's how it used to work. That's how it worked originally.
Right.
Mike, this is Pam in Delta. I'm going to ask a specific question. You may have already touched on this. This has to do with the independent homeschoolers. And some of the fears I keep hearing from these individuals is that they are afraid that now the government's going to get involved in their requirements of what they will have to do, that they cannot remain independent. And what I've heard from you is the thing that grants them this ability anyway was the statute that Lauren Lehman put out. So it would take, and this is my understanding, that means it would take a change of that statute in order for their fears to happen. Could you speak to that?
Yes, that's exactly correct, Pam. SJR 9 has nothing to do with that law that was passed by by Lauren Lehman, but by the legislature in the 90s. It has nothing to do with that. Those independent homeschoolers will remain independent, will stay independent, and as I've told people, anywhere I go, publicly, privately, it doesn't matter. I will do everything within my power to ensure that those folks are free to educate their children in the manner they see fit. And SJR 9 has nothing to do with those folks. Those folks would only be affected if they wanted to join a public homeschool concept. But as long as they want to remain independent, SJR 9 has no impact, no effect on them, and nor would I support anything that would change that reality.
Okay, well that was kind of my understanding because they're adamantly opposed to SJR 9 in fear of that. So basically, SJR 9 could actually still stay in, not SJR 9, you could do nothing to the Constitution, and still the legislatures could go in and change that statute if they wanted to, and then they would not be protected. Is that possible?
They could do that. They could do that this year. And I constantly have discussions with legislators down here that want to chase kids around and parents around and criminalize them because they want their kids in school to the age of 18, or they want to document homeschool families. I constantly have conversations with these people telling them that they have no business doing that I'm not going to support that, and I'll do everything I can to maintain that. But that's a totally separate issue from SJR 9. SJR 9 will not negatively impact anyone that's homeschooling their child and wants to remain independent. Not at all.
Okay, so the status quo is not going to protect them, and that's what I wanted to make clear. And I know that it's Common Core wants their data. So, anyways, I'll be on the side. Thanks.
Well, yeah, Pam. The issue with that becomes not SJR 9. It's SJR 9 leading to vouchers if the other provisions of that No Child Left Behind waiver, which I call the Common Core, because Common Core isn't just standards. If those are in place, it could become, their fears could be realized. Okay? And that's why there's a whole conundrum here for me. All right? Because with those accountability standards and that data and the testing, at least in the lower grades, that could become a very major issue. And for those people like Grunberg or Josephson, and the legislature, not the last one, not last year, but 2 years ago, when we had the bipartisan working group, that group would have destroyed homeschooling completely in the next session. That's where they were headed. I could see it. I could hear it in the tone of the language. I mean, when I listened to Joe Thomas, I knew that's exactly where he was headed. He was trying to figure out a politically expeditious way to do it. That's why I knew we had to change the legislature desperately. Anyway, but that Common Core, those other provisions of that No Child Left Behind waiver really do need to be addressed. Because if they're not, there could be some ramifications. And even if SJR 9 doesn't pass, there could be ramifications. So, I was absolutely shocked. Well, shut up. That's not what this is.
Hey, Barbara, I wanted to follow up that question too. This is something that's bothered me throughout the conversation about SJR 9, because I don't think you can keep the Common Core conversation separate from this discussion, because eventually what the state adopts as standards is going to have a big impact. I mean, it's all education. So,
well, and originally when this choice stuff was put in, there were no, I don't want to say there were no standards, but at least at that time, Hickle, like me, we both believed that if a parent was taking their life and investing it in the education of their child, that they would indeed give that child the best education that they believed they could give them. Okay? And so this whole notion that we have to have standards was really sort of in response to No Child Left Behind. That's why when we wrote Alaska 2000, we kept everything very soft. It was like, well, this is recommended. We try to make it more like guidelines. So like if a parent wanted to say, okay, I'm homeschooling, what are we supposed to do in 5th grade? They could look at that and get an idea of what the state thought a typical 5th grader might be studying. What kind of things, what kind of competencies would you want them to know to be able to match their public school cohorts if that was an issue for you? Now, for a lot of families, we just said basangu and went our merry way. I mean, that's certainly what I did. But that's not what a lot of families did. A lot of families went back and forth between homeschooling and public schooling, which I think is wrong-headed, but that's another story. They wanted to make sure that they kept their kids in line with what they were learning in public school. Certainly in the small homeschool co-ops, which are in existence and would legitimately be considered private schools if certain legislators knew about them. In those homeschool co-ops, certainly those guidelines weigh heavily, because part of their marketing is that, well, if tomorrow you decided that you wanted to put your kid in public school, you could. So, yeah, those things all weigh very heavily. They weigh very heavily. And the original choice, the state was not forcing parents to teach X, Y, Z. And it was a real, it was devastating, because those of us who were pursuing the classical curriculum, the Latin and the Greek and whatnot, we were totally devastated when they decided to go through with No Child Left Behind. It devastated the ability to stay in the system and be a classical educator, a Christian classical educator. With, so I just said, well, later days, and I just went my own way.
Could I get Mike to comment on that? Why it's so necessary to keep the discussion about Common Core and the standards out of this discussion on SJR?
I'm not saying that they have to be kept out of discussion. My thing has just been, I started this process last year, and it is pretty intensive and consuming, and the Common Core issue is also a huge issue that I think needs to be worked on. There's no denying that. It's just, I guess I was hoping there'd be some others down here that would lead the charge in some of these other educational issues that are very important. And I'm not, trust me, I'm not saying this to make any excuses. It's just it's a heavy lift to deal with a constitutional message.
Yeah, I agree.
And just
I agree with you 100% on that, Michael, on both statements.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it wasn't. I just wanted to clarify. It wasn't you that I heard that from. It was just throughout the activism related to this. I heard that in a lot of places, and I was just really curious how you could separate the two.
Yeah. Here's the thing. I mean, my big thing is this, and this is going to be the thread that is, as long as I'm down here, and God, I hope I'm not down here forever. Trust me. But as long as I'm here, my theme is going to be as much freedom as possible for the individual. And yes, I do have issues when something is mandated and imposed for all kids and for all people. I do. I have an issue with that because I think you kill innovation. I think you kill entrepreneurship. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing.
It's absolutely the wrong thing. And we know that. We have plenty of history not related to education where central planning just exactly kills competition and innovation. That's my only reason for supporting you on this. My kids they're out of college. They're gone. This doesn't impact my children, but as far as the future of Alaska, this is huge for our future. It has to be that the money is spent in a decentralized way. Otherwise, we'll have nothing but central planning. We'll have nothing but programs that come along that are No Child Left Behind. Oh, we'll let you out of that if you'll take this other next program.
And yet some of the bigger supporters of the Common Core are the people who are supporting SJR 9.
Yeah.
Explain that one.
Yeah.
And it's very, well, if you listen to Friedman, it's very clear, because that's their way of assuring quality control. All right? Well, I think that kind of freedom is not the kind of freedom I want. All right? That's just another form of tyranny, in my opinion. And that is why I have been remarkably quiet and kept myself kind of removed from things. Because until this, I get getting it on the ballot, okay? Fine, get it on the ballot. I'll be quiet. I know what the battle's going to be. You're going to need a lot of energy from me on that. So that's going to be a bigger battle. All right? You get it through the legislature. I know you can get that through. But this whole thing with these standards, and Mike, I'm going to tell you something. This is huge. Bill Gates gave money directly to the state of Alaska. All right? Now, you weren't in the legislature at the time when this happened. All right, but I have tracked money that went directly to the state government from the Gates Foundation for different elements of this Common Core spindle. All right, and I think I sent you a write-up on that. Yeah. All right. The corruption that's in this thing is huge. All right, and the people who are not acting when they told me they were going to act. I know that there was some Jeb Bush action happening. How's that? I'm just going to be quiet, and I'm not going to make any judgments because there's been a lot of other issues. And another issue, the only other Common Core pushback I can get if I can't get the standards fixed or repealed, preferably, is this is the bill that Tammy Wilson has to force the state to pick up the tab on all education. Because why should there be a local contribution? Why should Mike Hanley sit up there and say, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that? Well, then he expects the local districts to pick up the cost through the property tax. That basically gives that man the authority to determine my property taxes. I never voted for him to do that. I never voted for him to do anything. Do you get what I'm at here?
Yeah, no, I do, Barbara. I do. And I am.
I mean, anyway, so. I mean, I know we're kind of straying off that, but these things all end up coming up in this choice legislation. And that kind of gets to what Mike was talking about with the local property taxes. If we are able to get the state to do its constitutional mandate, the legislature to do their constitutional mandate, you wouldn't have the local. Well, you could technically have initiatives to cut your property taxes or eliminate them, perhaps even. Mm-hmm. They can't.
Go ahead, Pam.
This is Pam in Delta. I'd like to get back to SJR 9. I got some questions on that, but before we do, since we're already on the topic of Common Core, I don't know about other school districts, but the people who are for Common Core seem to be very against SJR 9, and that's the people in our school district in the NEA. They seem to be together on that, so I don't see that, Barbara, on that one. But one quick question on Common Core, Mike. Is there any discussion or any legislation addressing removing Common Core at all from our state?
I don't, not currently from this office, my office, and I'm not sure about Gaddis and Tammy, but I have to say, it's not because it's not an issue, again, and I don't want to make excuses, but I jumped on this horse and I'm in midstream here, and it's a 24/7, 365 deal. So the answer to your question, Pam, is not coming from my office at this time. I do have some serious concerns about what it does in terms of being an imposition, being a mandate, being an all-encompassing, monopolistic imposition on the folks of Alaska. I do. And so the best answer I can give you, and I'm not trying to dance here, is I'm halfway in the stream with this thing here. I got to see it through. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that we got to continue to work on. Not straying too far here, but you'll see some bills that are coming out. They're trickling out one at a time, but I've got my name on with some other people that have to do with data collection, surveillance, et cetera, because a lot of this stuff is tied together in terms of us being able to maintain our independence in who we are. But this is not the end. SJR 9 is not the end of anything. It's we got a number of fights to fight, and we just named a few of them here. So as soon as I can get this thing taken care of, we move on to other issues.
Hey, Mike, Mike, this is Maria again, Pam. Tammy Wilson sponsored H.R. 9, and that is urging the commissioner, it's a resolution, urging the Commissioner of Education and Early Development and the State Board of Education and Early Development to delay implementation of statewide education standards. I think that came out of the task force.
Right, but that's kind of a wet noodle. I mean, I'll take it. It's better than nothing, but when I take it, I compare that to what Wyoming's preparing to pass, it looks very lame. I mean, there's 3 or 4 other states right now where there's some very solid legislation making its way through.
Okay. Well, Michael, thanks a lot. You also touched on the data collection one, and I was going to follow up with that. But back to the Constitution, there's that one phrase that was left in there: schools and institutions so established shall be free from sectarian control. That's being left in there. Now somebody who, and I'm going to throw this out as an example, if somebody who's using the Becca homeschool program, does SJR 9 affect them one way or the other? Does that mean that they still cannot use public funds for that program?
If they're going to, under SB 100, if SJR 9 is passed and SB 100 is passed, they would be able to use any vendor, and we would pay for any vendor. We wouldn't pay for religious instruction, but we would pay for vendors that support the ILP of a child enrolled in these homeschool correspondence programs. And that particular statement also keeps that separation, that independence, in my opinion, and the opinion of some others that are looking at the Constitution, it maintains that separation, that independence for those religious and private educational institutions, so that we don't get the long arm of the government screwing around with them.
Right, but Michael, when they buy that curriculum, it has to meet the Common Core standards. If it's not Common Core aligned, the state won't pay for it. They're already being told that.
Then that's something we'll have to deal with, because we're dealing with, for example, hundreds of vendors that for the MATSU uses that are national vendors that I don't think they're aligned to Common Core. I could be wrong, but I don't think they're aligned to Common Core. What the state is probably going to try and force people to do is their ILPs will have to be constructed to meet proficiency in whatever test that they're going to come up with. I mean, that's, like I said, this is, I don't want to sound silly here, but I was just the other night, I was looking at Washington lost, I think, 7 out of 10 battles but won the war. The point I'm trying to make is there's a number of battles that we're going to be fighting here for a couple years at least, and I don't want to poo-hoo it, but there's a lot of undoing that needs to happen.
Yeah.
This is James Squires, Delta Junction. First of all, I want to say that Fight for Liberty is a lifetime battle, and we don't have any kids, but we could sure look very carefully and see if the school district has got a lot of risk on our liberty. And I want to encourage everybody to go to school board meetings. They're awful boring oftentimes, but they need your presence there. I was speaking at the little public comment section, and I hope we got at least one board member from our local area here. We called and invited them earlier. Anyway, my little speech was about fiscal responsibility, and somewhere in there I let out that I was supporting SJR 9, and afterwards a board member came up to me, not the one that I'm invited on here tonight, but came up to me and said, now we're concerned that this SJR 9 is going to cost the state a lot more money. What if you have a private school? Is the state going to be required to bus people to the private school? So I'm wondering if that's a real concern.
No.
One. And then two, she immediately, the next week, used state money to fly down to Juneau to lobby against SJR 9. So, anyway.
No.
If you listen to Milton Friedman will tell you the biggest opponents to the purchase order or vendor agreements are the administrators. It's not the NEA. Ultimately, when you go and you look at the Bronx program and you look at the other programs, the big perpetrators or the big underminers were the principals. Because what happens is you shrink the administration to nothing. And those principals derive their power from the size of their administrative overhead.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Barbara,
it's the agency theory.
Barbara, stand by just a second. Mike, can you address the school bus deal? Let me finish up there first.
The SJR 9, again, does not create any program. The legislature would have to decide, once SJR 9 is voted in and is the law of the land for the state of Alaska in terms of education, the legislature would then have to go back and decide if they even want a program. The only program I've got going right now that would operate under this is SB 100, and that would be an enhanced homeschool correspondence program. There's no discussions about money for buses or transportation or private schools, none of that stuff.
Okay, real fine. Well, I'll tell you, one of the sourdoughs I was talking to around here, that we had a very long discussion, and he finally ended up calling Senator Bishop, on behalf of SJR 9, we talked about the status quo around here, and what ultimately swung the case is that we've got some big problems in the state financially. And some people seem to think that the status quo is acceptable. But the status quo, when you start to crack the numbers on some of these school districts, are far from acceptable. If you take just in our area here and break the amount spent in 1 year, it's not just the BSA, but it's the BSA plus all the federal money that came in, all the various programs, the school bus money, all that money, you divide it by the number of kids. In our area, it comes out to $18,679 per kid. You multiply that out times just 12 years, that's $224,000. You got 3 kids in your family, putting through 12 years of school, that's $672,000 of money. Now, if that's not pork in there, I don't know what is, and we've got a big problem with how we're dipping into our savings in this state and a huge financial crisis on the horizon. This is a huge cancer on our system. It's the status quo. We've got to do something to break it. So you certainly have my support on anything that can help in this state to change our direction, because our current direction, as is completely unacceptable as we're heading for a brick wall.
Let me give you just briefly. Let me give you something else that hopefully this will keep you up at night. The Big 5 school districts, and talking with some of their CFOs the other night, if there is no change in terms of no additional money going their way, and if the contract trajectory that they have does not change, the Big 5, it is estimated in the next 5 to 7 years alone will have a structural deficit approaching $500 million. That's just 5 of the largest school districts, the 5 largest school districts. There are schools now under the Casile suit that the state settled with here a year or so ago that for less than 200 kids are scheduled to be built that will cost $80 million. It costs $44,000 to educate a kid in the Aleutian Region School District. It costs $26,000 to educate them at Edgecombe. It costs them $4,400 to educate them in the homeschool correspondence program. We can educate kids, I think, to a high quality. I think can give them as much freedom as possible, including their parents, if they so choose to be part of a public school program. If they don't, they want to be homeschoolers not associated with it, we will protect them and continue to protect them. If they want to be in private school not associated with public school, we will protect them and continue to protect their independence. But for those that are involved in the public school system, there are different ways to deliver education that are way cost effective, in which parents and families would trade a seat in a classroom for some independence and freedom. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do down here. But no, I agree with you, Jim. It's a frightening scenario. We're on a rail here that if we don't change here within the next year or two, it's going to be difficult.
Well, I find and from my exposure to school boards, it's very easy when dealing with budgets. Everybody gets a little raise and a little bit more money comes in. And it's all politically correct to boost it just a little bit. But to turn around and take dramatic steps in the other way, to actually cut expenses dramatically to live within your means, takes a lot of political guts to do that, because people find themselves not in favor. They get voted out of office. So to do anything other than just even sequester for just a few pennies is a very difficult thing to do. But by the very nature of a budgeting process, when somebody's got a $10,000 budget for their year and they spent $9,000, they got an extra $1,000 there, they feel like they got to hurry up and spend it so that they can get a little bit more next year. Otherwise, they might get penalized. So there's no incentive to pull back the expenses to where we need to be. And what this has turned into is an inherent cancer in the system where it seems like a few have got a monopolistic death grip on the system, which is eventually going to affect our liberty, because when the numbers don't match, when we get to 2023, we're going to be looking at a state income tax, a state sales tax, or, a slice of it, and a slice of income off the TSD to make things balance. And it's better to make these hard decisions up front now than to wait until it gets into crisis.
I agree. Guys, I'm going to have to leave you here. I got to get up in the morning to deal with the meeting here about 6:30 in the morning. So I appreciate the time to talk with you, and like I said, this is one battle amongst many. We've got to continue to wage, and that's what we're going to keep doing.
All right. Well, Mike, thanks very, very much for being on tonight. We really did overstay our welcome to it. We've been on for about an hour and 20 minutes, so we appreciate you. A lot of us are here for you as you fight those battles ongoing. So thanks again for coming on.
Hey Maria, before Mike,
keep kicking us in the rear.
Before Mike leaves, can we? Is there anything we can do to help or support this?
The only thing I would say at this stage of the meeting today is this: when folks talk with you, there's the Friedman site. And the only reason I bring the Friedman site up is they've consolidated all of the quote school choice programs in the country in a very easily read manner. And I would just say to people when they talk about, we're going to lose $100 million here, or it's going to rain toads from the sky, or we're going to invest in the Vatican, I'd ask them to just slow down and do a little bit of research. I'd ask them the question: where did you find this? Did you read this somewhere? Did you research this? 99% of the time, they're just hearing this from folks that are just trying to divert people's attention or make this just to be truly a negative thing. Just tell them to do a little research. There's no precedent for a lot of the things these people are saying. And it is coming from NEA to some degree, and it's also coming from the School Boards Association, the principals, et cetera. But just tell them to do some research.
We'll do that. Yep. And
good work, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Go get him.
All right, and so that's probably going to end our call, and we're here for the after call. So feel free to stay on for a while. I'll be here.